As I said in my my summary of teachings in the recent email, this text, the more I study it, it really feels like a complex dream. So one question that I'll say an approach to studying the text I'd like to share with you is seeing a Torah portion, for example, as a dream. Now, the basis of dream interpretation, one basic of dream interpretation is whatever unconscious faculty in the human being creates dreams, the order of the dream is supremely important. I did dream interpretation work for a very long time. I've tried to, I think if I count the years up, it was 17 years, 1993, 2010. I worked with a very extraordinary spiritual teacher. And among the things we studied was in dream interpretation. And one thing he taught me was, generally speaking, dreams are three-act plays, which is why three-act plays are so appealing to us, because they actually correspond with a future of human consciousness. So I would say, well, I had this really weird dream, and we would do act one, the little bit that I remember, and then a dream that felt like it was a completely separate dream, and then a third completely separate dream. And my teacher's opinion was act two follows from act one. It just it changes the setting, it changes the characters, it changes the location, but it's part of the same unit of meaning that the unconscious is trying to communicate. So one thing I learned from dream interpretation is the unconscious places the parts of the dream in an order that creates meaning. And once one learns to pay attention to the order of dreams, one can begin to understand the meaning that dreams are trying to communicate. It's a very, very complex process doing dream interpretation. And one thing I kept promising, in my various classes I would teach for our Wisdom Institute was a class on dream interpretation. We're gearing up to get it going, and I promise I'll do a class on that, record it, we'll make it on demand later on. But I think when one knows how to interpret dreams, it just opens up a part of the unconscious. In fact, the Talmud says that a dream uninterpreted is like an email not opened. They didn't say that. What they said is a dream uninterpreted is a letter not opened. So they clearly had letters in those days, but who gets letters anymore, right? So the dream comes and it says, please open me and read. So we look at our Torah portion, we look at these different literary units. It didn't come boxed in this order. It's a very important part of what I'll call post-Orthodox understanding of Torah. The text of the Torah has many different sources. There is a later editor, they call the redactor, who took all these different traditions and wove them together into our text. If you look at the major theories called the documentary hypothesis, you can look that up. It talks about the major sources, different places, different times, different people. It was bequeathed to the hands of a redactor who took all of these different sources and wove them into an order as a great literary accomplishment. So when you read the Torah, you're not just reading the text, you're reading several different texts that have been woven together by a redactor or editor who in my mind was a literary genius. So the placement of the units of the chapters of the Bible and even the parts of a Torah portion is itself a literary achievement, is itself a literary construction. Now, that being said, when we look at this week's Torah portion that begins with the Para Aduma, the red heifer, where the discussion is the ritual of using the blood of the red heifer to help a person be rid of the tum'ah, the impurity of death, the importance of that is not the details. Now, because I have a background in symbolic anthropology, I was very interested in how it worked, from a symbolic anthropological level, how the taint of death could be removed by a ritual. I was very interested in it. It didn't occur to me, all those years studying that the so-called meaning of chapter 14 is not the ritual itself, but rather introducing the Torah portion as being concerned with death. Now, I want you to think for a moment. let's say we have this unit called Torah portion Chukat. And again, the portion was delineated by the rabbis, but the rabbis had a great sense of where these literary units begin and end. So let's say you have many traditions at hand. You have the death of Miriam, you have the death of Aaron, you have Moses being sentenced to death, not entering the land. Many different elements. You're going to put them together a certain way, but you want to introduce it. And I imagine the editor having this piece of literature on the cutting room floor, this strange ritual of the red heifer, the para aduma, doesn't seem to belong anywhere. And this stroke of genius in my mind. Now remember, I think the text is brilliant, so I could be overreading the text, but the person says, I'm going to put this here. The text about death, I'm going to put it here to introduce the next part, which is the death of Miriam. Now, I began to understand these things more deeply when I began to study Hasidic literature, and there's a wonderful Hasidic drash that I think captures the spirit of Torah portion Chukat by looking at exactly 3 words, if I'm not mistaken, and that is in the book of our Torah portion, Numbers chapter 19, and you go down to verse 14. It's actually 5 words. Numbers 19:14. It says the following: Zot haTorah Adam ki yamut ba'ohel. This is the teaching concerning a man who dies in a tent. The Hasidic rabbis cut that off and said, Zot haTorah Adam ki yamut. This is the Torah because people die. Notice they've taken this section that talks about the rich being relieved of the taint of death. The Hasidic teachers, I believe on a midrash, pulled out Zot haTorah Adam ki yamut. This is the Torah because people die. Now, what followed from that in this Hasidic text that I'll teach another time is something very profound. Why do we have Torah? I mean, why do we have this deep study of the human condition that takes us into the soul? Because we're finite. And in our finitude, many people, and I think the people gathered here, we're looking for meaning and purpose in this finite life. We're not here for nothing. There's something, we have sometimes a very strong spiritual sense. However existentially stranded I am while here, I do have something I'm supposed to do that has to do with what is good, right, and true. Bring well-being to myself and other people as much as I can. So, having spent many years as an existentialist, we're stranded in a meaningless universe. And from that, we are our own meaning creators. Before I studied Kabbalah, and I had a sense of what it means to be a human being, it's based on the idea we all have work to do in our finitude. Zot haTorah, this is the teaching because we are all going to die. And therefore, whatever our purpose is, whatever our meaning is, don't start late. Get your work done. And so therefore, when I study our entire wisdom tradition and the wisdom traditions of, the many traditions that I've been exposed to, one part of it is how to conduct yourself. Another part of it is how to think well. Another part of it is how to find purpose and meaning in life. I have 10 things I want to list for you, but the first 3 are a conscious human being is interested in how to conduct yourself. A conscious human being is interested in what I would call derech hamachshava, how to think well. And third, the conscious human being is interested in derech hapnimiyut, the inner life path. Zot haTorah Adam ki yamut. So 3 things. I'll list the other 7 another time. Your conduct as a human being, how to think well, so that your own thinking doesn't cause problems. In fact, your thinking helps you solve problems. And number 3, the inner life path. So I'm going to call this little introductory part of the text says, people die. Zot haTorah Adam ki yamut. This is the teaching because people die. And then it wants to give us a specific case, which is the death of Miriam. Now, it jumps right into the death of Miriam, and the reader is somewhat shocked, as the people seem to be. So when we go to the book of the book of Numbers chapter 20, it says they arrived in the wilderness of Sin in the 1st month. They settled there, And verse 1 just runs on and says, Vatamot Sham Miriam, Vatika Versham. And Miriam died there, and she was buried there. The next sentence, verse 2 says, Velo haya maim la'edah. The community did not have water, and they fell apart. So here's a second thing I want to share with you is where Midrash comes from. You've all heard of the Midrash. It's not in the Bible. It's commentaries of the rabbis in the Midrash and the Talmud. What propels them to write a Midrash? What propels the ancient rabbis to write a Midrash? Well, what we have here is a perfect example of why the rabbis write a Midrash. Because if you look in verse 1, it's a run-on sentence. They arrived at the wilderness of Tzin. Miriam died and was buried, right? Without a pause. It's shocking when you read it. And then it says, the people had no water, and they gathered against Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if we only had perished as our brethren perished, meaning their parents, before God. Why did you bring us to this wilderness to die here, we and our animals? Why did you bring us from Egypt to this evil place? Not a place of seed or fig or grape or pomegranate. There's no water to drink. So they were screaming in despair. Now we look at this disjunction, and the rabbis of the Talmud ask themselves, is there a connection between Miriam dying and no water? Because the two verses are connected to each other. This is called the interpretation based on juxtaposition. So the rabbis invented a tradition called the Well of Miriam, because the juxtaposition of Miriam died, there was no water. The rabbis, in a playful, poetic way, concluded that as long as Miriam was alive, there was water, and therefore they invented the tradition of Miriam's well. Now, why am I emphasizing this to you? Many people discuss Miriam's well as if it's in the Bible. So they go looking for it in the Bible. Well, it's not in the Bible. It's a brilliant poetic creation of the rabbis who took the juxtaposition of Miriam dying and the people having no water, and then it helped develop the archetype of Miriam. I hope you're following my train of thought. If we look at the biblical characters, and we want to try to create archetypes of them to understand ourselves better, how these archetypes work within us, there's sparse material on Miriam. The rabbis of the Talmud deeply developed the character, and they developed the character of Miriam to a person, poetically, who actually had a well of living water accompany her in the time in the desert, and metaphorically, one of those human beings who was a wellspring of water. Now, you know, the idea of the wellspring of water is a very profound idea. Many of the Psalms that I've memorized have the idea that deep inside of human consciousness, there's a Makor Chaim. There's a well of water that flows up within us. And one of our jobs as a human being is to, I spoke about this many times, is to remove the debris down in the unconscious to allow the well of water to flow within us. Well, Miriam is the archetype of the living well of water inside every human being, but we allow the well to get filled up. Now, I'm not going to spend this morning discussing the archetype of Miriam. It would be well worth our discussion. I just wanted to teach a second skill to you. The first skill, meaning distinguish between the text and belief and opinions. A third skill, actually. The second skill is understanding that placement itself is a literary achievement, meaning whoever put this puzzle together took pieces and put them into a literary chain. And third, where Midrash comes from, and sometimes Midrash is as if the text screams out, please interpret me. Death of Miriam, no water. There's space here for a beautiful Midrash. And the rabbis, as literary geniuses, fill in that space. So 3 things so far: distinguish between text and opinions. Number 2, placement as a literary achievement. And number 3, how Midrash comes into being. Now, the fourth thing I want to talk about today, going back to last week, is the depth of spiritual, psychological insight based on the reading of the text. Now, what happens next is rather astonishing, because we are reading a text that purportedly describes the people in their 40th year in the desert. which means the 38 years of the previous generation has ended. They had been in the desert for 2 years, 38 more living out their lifetimes because of the rebellion of the sin of the spies. They said, you're going to stay here, right here at Kadesh Barnea. You're not moving. You're all dying until your children come. And we assume as the children grow up and said, why aren't we going into the promised land? It's right over that little hill there. And they say, we can't go. Why can't we go? Parents say, well, I have something really awful I need to tell you. It's my fault. Mom, Dad, what did you do? Well, I was young. I wasn't thinking. Moses, God, Aaron brought us right to the edge of the land, sent us out to take a look at it. And we came in and we said, we want to go back to Egypt. The kids go, what? How could you possibly say you want to go back to Egypt? Parents says, I know, we were crazy. We were crazy. And God more or less said, I can't let you go into that land if you can't get that crazy place outside of you. And if you can't get it, you got to die here and raise some non-crazy children. And so the parents say, okay, so we're going to raise non-crazy children. And part of raising non-crazy children is admit your faults. So this is my mythological reconstruct. The parents say, here's why we didn't go in the land. We made up our realities, we made up facts, and had our emotions follow the facts, and then acted our emotions. Now, by the way, this is a core fault of the human condition. Living here in Israel, it's exemplified day after day after day. As we talk to people, read things, something happens, and some interpreter wants you to spin it in a way to agree with their political views. So they take what happens and then they describe it beguzma, in the most hyperbolic, exaggerated imagined way possible. So it right away appeals to the emotions. Then people assume that what they feel is actually the fact, and people live in alternative realities. Now, how do me, Rob, and I know? Because sometimes we say to people, can you just tell me what exactly happened, police report style? Not what you think, not what you feel, not what the commentator said. What exactly did the person say? Okay? In what context? Now, the problem is many Israeli politicians themselves are guilty of this horrible hyperbolic thought filled with hatred. It's all over the place. It's very disturbing. What we say to people is, because if they're infected with with horrible hyperbole filled with hatred, you don't have to be infected with it. You can actually calm yourself down and think rationally. You don't have to imitate crazy people. Now, one of my definitions of crazy here is create reality by the drama that you want to be true, and then have your emotions follow the created reality instead of the reality that we can actually get at. We actually can get at the facts of the matter much more easily than we think. I just read somebody wrote an article for the Jerusalem Post, says, I don't know what's true. And he described all the different theories going out there. And maybe I'll write a response. You can get closer to the truth than you think. Just don't listen to people who are engaged in metaphoric hyperbole filled with hatred. The first thing, if you want to get to the truth, don't listen to hyperbolic hatred. That'll take you away from the truth. Now, once you cleanse yourself of this hyperbolic hatred, then you can get down to what might be the truth of the matter. So when the spies came back from the land of Canaan, they didn't say, well, it's a pretty good land, but we were scared. And we don't even want to tell you how scared we were. Moses says, I really appreciate it. Let's now make a battle plan. What they said is, great land, but there were giants there. Mamash giants, like 8 feet tall. Everybody was Goliath. And the cities were fortified, and the people were fierce. And Moshe says, where's this coming from? They're just people like you. They're like we are. No, we cannot do it. Now they're military intelligence experts, and they say, we actually can't conquer the land. And Moses says, you're not doing what I asked you to do. Now, everybody got infected with it, right? This hyperbolic, how the other people look, which exacerbated their own fear. Now, try to imagine if they were like Caleb and Joshua, who said, wait a minute. I'm imagining their longer conversation. They weren't all giants. The cities were not as fortified as you say. We saw some gaps in their defenses. We think we can actually do what God is asking of us, but they got shouted down. Now, so if the parents say to the children, here's how we behaved, my second part of the theory is that behavior didn't end quickly, which means these children, meaning the adults of our Torah portion, grew up with parents who constantly engaged in hyperbolic, metaphoric hatred. Parents who constantly engaged in hyperbolic, metaphoric hatred. Now, this is a real thing. When Trump was elected in 2016, people began to notice that the depression among teenagers increased, even before COVID. And they did some investigating. They realized parents who talk about it's the end of the world. Climate change is going to destroy the world. This is the worst it's ever been. You remember that? 2016, not 1942, not 1862. In the whole history of planet Earth, 2016-17 was the worst it's ever been. Now, children don't know any better. The parents didn't say, actually, 1942 was actually a very bad year. This is nothing compared to 1942. That was a bad year. Or in American history, 1862 was a bad year. 62, 63, 64, yeah. We're trying to work out the shame of slavery, and 500,000 people ended up getting killed over it. So it was a bad thing that we did as Americans, and it was a bad way to solve it. Instead, and I can pick out so many other examples in modern history, including the Holocaust, including the Chinese genocide of the Japanese genocide of 20 million Chinese. I can go on and on and on. Nope. 2017 was the worst it has ever been. Now, that has an effect on kids. The world's going to end. The world's going to be destroyed. The leaders are worse than Hitler. Remember that? Worse than Hitler. Well, people don't know their history. If you know the history of Hitler, you don't even want to breathe those words. I'm ashamed that I even have to say those words. So I try to imagine this idea of people living among catastrophizing parents who say that things have never been this bad, as if they have no sense of history whatsoever. You can tell I'm against it. I'm against parents. I am in favor of parents saying, look, here's what's happening right now. Don't listen to the hyperbolic hatred. Don't listen to these exaggerations that my mind border on breaks with reality. Here's something happening. We're rational people. We don't have to imitate our leaders who are trying to have us glam onto them because they think they have the solution to the worst it's ever been. Okay? We don't have to, our thing does not have to imitate their thinking. So this is my theory. And by the way, it's part of my Parenting the Soul of the Child class. Do not teach your children to despair. Do not tell your children it's the worst it's ever been. Don't tell your children you don't have a future and that humanity has no future. Don't teach your children those things, A, because they're not true, and because they paralyze your children. Now, so in my imagination, this new generation of adults, let's say they're all in their 20s and 30s now, they grew up in families of catastrophizing parents who never stopped. That's why they couldn't get into the land of Canaan. In my opinion, now remember, this is my spiritual psychological reconstruction, they never stopped. So now, how could these children suddenly say, we want to go back to Egypt? This is terrible, because that's what they heard at home. So even when children know that feelings are not rational, they're not connected to reality, the way that parents talk get into the children, and unless the parents consciously want to extricate that thinking, and I think parents can do that. Parents can say to kids, I want to apologize to you. The way that I spoke, the way that I saw the world, I think it got inside of you. I want to help get that out of you. I want to teach you how to think more rationally, more clearly, with a greater sense of moral realism that, I think is essential to the future of humanity. Parents can do that, and parents should do that. So when I come to this next section, where the people are now catastrophizing and sounding like their parents because they grew up in their parents' home. Why'd you bring us out of Egypt to this evil place? Well, they heard their parents say that all the time. Now, if you could sit down for a second and say, look, I need to talk to you for a minute. Sit down. We're going to now talk about Egypt because it was our grandparents. So it's an alive memory. So let me tell you what Egypt was like by the numbers. And let's discuss what it's like now. Yeah, it's a desert, it's tough, but it's not Egypt. So if you say because things aren't going your way, you want to go back to Egypt. You are thinking like a crazy person, not in my home. Describe reality as it is, describe Egypt as it was, and then figure out how to solve the problem that things are bad. Going back to the teaching of M. Scott Peck and Road Less Traveled, I mean, it's a real brilliant, in my mind, recapitulation of humanistic psychology. Life is a series of problems. And the main thing that we human beings have to do is think through our problems in rational, moral, and productive ways, right? The main thing we have to do with our lives, think about our problems in rational, moral, and productive ways, and not avoid the suffering that rational thinking requires. Because when you gather the facts of the matter, we're going to be miserable. We're going to be sad. But then that allows us, as I spoke about last week and the week before, to go through misery and grief into wisdom. That's the line. Reality, misery, grief, wisdom. That's the line. Now, what doesn't help is hyperbolic, hateful speaking and thinking. That does not help us become wise. So how could these people do it? Because they were wounded, traumatized, as it were, by their parents catastrophizing. And just as their parents weren't allowed into the land, one could say, well, if they're doing the same thing, why aren't they forbidden from going to the land? And again, from my spiritual psychological interpretation, God, Moses, look at them and say, you're regressing. You're traumatized by your parents. This is not who you are. You're saying things you heard. You don't even believe it. So we're going to let this one slide. So that's my another skill I want to teach, and including in addition to distinguishing between beliefs, opinions, and the text, placement as a literary device, the creation of midrash. The spiritual psychological version, of course, is looking at an event. And again, this is pure spiritual psychological midrash. I don't have any way to validate this other than appeal to you. Does this seem like a reasonable spiritual psychological understanding of what's happening in this text? Now, a person can say, well, that's not my spiritual psychological understanding. Give me another interpretation. I'll learn from you. So we get to the spiritual psychological dimension. There's no canon of authorized interpretation. It's forays into meaningfulness. I mean, how do I find this meaningful? I look at my own life experience. I look at my family. I look at my counseling practice, look at all my teaching, the reality that I've gained from all of this, and then the wisdom that I try to achieve from it, and then, as it were, abstract what I'm sharing with you into a wisdom, which is rational, productive, moral thinking as a way to solve our problems, which is a core feature of human life.